Hi, I'm Bruce Pattons from Total Education Centre, and this is the video that everyone's been waiting for. This is the Merchant of Venice, Text and Human Experiences, and we're going to be looking at a few different topics today. Those topics are xenophobia, love, friendship, appearance and reality, mercy, revenge, justice, and a sort of a look at the tragic drift that goes on within the play. So sit back, relax, and let's start with xenophobia. So we've looked at xenophobia previously in the context, and that context explains what the meaning of xenophobia is, but I'll repeat it here. It's basically a fear of outsiders, and we see it in current society, so it's still relevant when we study The Merchant of Venice today. My cameraman's just mentioned Pauline Hanson. I'm not going to go down that path, but if you think about the idea of xenophobia and a fear of strangers and a fear of the alienation that they bring, that feeling, that's xenophobia. And that's what Shylock suffers in The Merchant of Venice. But there are other human experiences that I mentioned in the introduction, and we need to talk about the stories that build up around that. The Venetian attitude to Shylock is very consistent. It moves forward. He is the outsider. There is a certain amount of xenophobia. There's certainly racism in there, and I've explained the inherent nature of that previously. If we look at what role it plays in the sense of human experience, Shylock can be seen as an outsider, as the one who's preyed upon in many ways, and it's no wonder that in some instances he's been portrayed as a sympathetic character with a lot of reasons for revenge and reasons for the things that he does. If we think the way he's treated and the way even his daughter treats him. Traditionally, in Elizabethan times and right up to nearly this century, he was seen as the villain of the play, the hated figure, the one that's prepared to call an outrageous bond and actually cut a pound of flesh from a living man. The audience feared and hated him. Older audiences were relieved when he fails in his duty because of Portia. But is he a villain because of his character, or is he a villain because of his race? And that's the question you need to ask yourself about the idea of human experience in the play. What do we like about Shylock? Are we supposed to dislike him as a person? Are we supposed to dislike him because he's a Jew? What was Shakespeare trying to do? When we discussed the play, and I talked about a little bit about this previously, Elizabethan audiences saw Shylock as very different to us. Shylock is exactly what an Elizabethan audience would have expected him to be, but I don't think we can draw the conclusion that the play is anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish in any way. Shakespeare's just telling the story. Shylock is not necessarily the stereotypical Jew, but he is the walking reinforcement of that Elizabethan fear of the outsider that the English had, and certainly most of it, or all of the audience, would not have travelled in any way outside of England and would have feared even people from different parts of England in many ways. That's turned around a lot, as we've talked about previously. Many productions in the last 100 years have turned that around and have tried to make, and succeeded in some ways, of making Shylock a more sympathetic character. We don't like the way his daughter leaves him to elope with a Christian. We don't like the way she steals money and jewellery from him. He's a solitary figure with no real friends. Tubal is polite towards him, but doesn't really offer him anything in sense of friendship, and does mock him in a certain way. Shylock goes into the courtroom scene confident in what we believe is the upper hand. He wants his revenge, he wants his pound of flesh, and he has been mistreated. But Portia stops him before he can stop himself. And anyway, that scene then becomes the gradual annihilation of Shylock in many ways, if you want to call it, as a human being. Not only is his culture taken away, his religion's taken away, and he's threatened with his life. So we can feel some sympathy for him at that point. Another way of looking at that xenophobia is to cast an eye on the xenophobic characters in the play, the Christians, who don't treat Shylock very well at all. They are very insular in their approach. They look at one aspect of life, and they're not really Christian. They don't show much charity at all, and it's only a little bit of mercy at the end of the play, which I'll talk about later, where we can see that. So you need to look at those aspects of the human experience and see where that takes you on your studies. You need to see how you respond to the play, and you need to look at the contrast and contradictory notes in that sort of xenophobia. The next thing we'll talk about is love. All of Shakespeare's comedies are about love, and while we might say The Merchant of Venice is a strange kind of comedy, it was initially set in that sort of tone. It's not typically comedic in the Shakespearean sense, but the treatment of love isn't typical either. Love is a crucial element of the human experience, and Shakespeare allows us to see several perspectives in the play. I know the definition of love can vary between people and characters, but just think about the different forms of love in the play and put them under that umbrella. For one thing, most comedies end in marriage, and The Merchant of Venice, the marriages happen in the middle of the play. This is quite a very big change in the structure of Shakespearean drama, and it's very interesting to note that the final scene is not that happy wedding scene that we normally expect. Why he does that is for several reasons. Love itself is the focus, with less attention being placed on the marriage as the proof and culmination of love. In fact, early in the play, marriage is really a game of chance. It's not about love, and we can see that with the caskets. All of the three couples fall in love very quickly, but seem to fall wisely. So there's not a misplaced love. It is as though love is out there, complete and perfect. All you have to do is find the right person. Love is not bothered by what we might call distractions in the play either. Bassiano and Gratiano are shocked to hear their wives are with them in court, as Balthazar and his clerk, but don't seem bothered about it. They respond as good characters, have a bit of fun and a bit of laugh. When it's shown that they have slept with their wives, Balthazar and the clerk again are in fact their wives themselves. Gratiano gets into a bawdy pun about his wife's genitals, and everyone seems fine about the whole thing. So there's that comedic humour behind the love as well, that sense of relationship, that sense of enjoying yourself, being together. In a sense, Jessica and Lorenzo withstand the greatest challenge in they must elope, and Jessica must betray her father. But things go remarkably smoothly for them despite those circumstances. In some ways, some authors and critics have seen this as love conquers all, and love conquers religion, love conquers division, love conquers all those sorts of things. You can take that if you want to, or you can look at it from another perspective depending on how you see the play. The opening passage of the last scene of the play shows them in idyllic circumstances, the happiest of the lover. They are not touched at all by Shylock's destruction. In fact, they happily accept the financial benefits of it. The play doesn't tell us much about the nature of love, but it is resilient. It does overcome and it does strive, and it sort of raises up love, and it celebrates that joy of love. So you need to put that into the context, in the contrast of the more tragic elements in the play and the paradoxes within those. But you need to remember that love is part of those human experiences, and is very clear in this text. The next thing we'll talk about is friendship. We see some very close friendships in the play, but the real friendship is Antonio and Bassiano, and Antonio sacrifices much for Bassiano. And in fact, many characters have shown it and seen it as a sense of love between Antonio and Bassiano. He says in the play, "I think he only loves the world for him." And he's very calm in the courtroom. Antonio, in some ways, loves Bassiano, but he gives it up for Portia. And we see that sense of friendship is there. There's not a lot of other friendship in the play, and the Venetian characters don't really show that, as I was talked about with Shylock. The next thing we'll talk about is appearance and reality. Appearance and reality, they're terms I don't really like using when I'm talking about Shakespeare and that sort of facade or veneer of civilization over characters. But it is really emphasised in this play through the caskets. And we notice that because of the caskets, both Morocco and Aragon mistakenly equate exterior beauty with inward value. And only Bassiano recognises the fact that outer beauty does not necessarily reflect that inner beauty, that what's within oneself. And that's a good lesson from the human experience point of view. He says, the world is still deceived with ornament. That's all very well for choosing caskets, but Portia is certainly externally beautiful, according to the play, and she's rich as well. Surely the lesson there is that you can be both good looking and inwardly wonderful. In Shylock, for example, he's a very caricatured figure in many ways in Shakespearean times, but has more depth, not superficial at all when you look at it from a more modern perspective. So you need to look at the characters in those particular ways and see what's happening there. If the message of the caskets is that, like, change and difference between appearance and reality, we need to think about what that shows, which characters in it, can it be applied to life, what do we say about those things? Jessica, for example, deceives her father, but to the outside world she's all lovely and charming and wonderful. There seems to be no consequences to deception in the play, and deception is valued in the play. So what Shakespeare's saying there about the human experience, that's something you'll need to decide and think about when you write your essays. The next topic we want to talk about is mercy. Mercy comes down to Portia's famous set piece in Act 4, Scene 1. It's a lyrical homily on equality that's particularly a Christian principle that we don't see much of in that period in the play until that particular moment in time. There's not a lot of mercy shown in the play towards anybody for any reason until that particular moment, and that's a nice contrast in the play as well. And we can look at characters and realize why they do that and why they don't do those sorts of things. Arguably, the Duke shows mercy towards Shylock when he allows him to live when he could have had him executed, but Portia sort of has brought mercy into the play, and therefore people start to think about it. Shylock himself shows no mercy towards anybody, and we've talked about the reasons for that previously, and I won't go much into it. But remember, mercy is a Christian principle in many ways, and that comes through in the play, and that would have certainly appealed to Shakespearean audiences. The next thing I want to talk about quickly is the idea of revenge. It's Shylock who goes for revenge. He sees the Christian treatment of Jews as a revenge for the killing of Christ, and he argues for common humanity and that we should have respect for everybody, which is a particularly modern thing to argue, and very interesting that Shakespeare wrote it in that particular time, in Elizabethan times, of course. Shylock then goes on to want to take his own revenge in a way that's particularly vengeful, and in fact wants to pay back the Christians for what they've taught him about revenge. Revenge is enacted upon Shylock by Portia, especially with the support of Gratian, and less so Bassiano and her unwitting husband. Portia turns out to be a more powerful revenger, certainly, than anybody in the play in many ways, because she does get a revenge, not by killing him, but by taking away his dignity and his culture. She strips him of everything that's important to him and takes away really his motivation to live. It's a very interesting part of the decision-making process and how people deal with each other, and those human experiences can be both positive and negative, and that's one aspect you need to look at when you look at the play. We're going to look at also, finally, justice and the judiciary. Elizabethan audiences are said to have loved a court scene, and court scenes are very prevalent in plays of that time. The law is very important to them. English law during Shakespearean times allowed for two kinds of justice. There were the common law courts where matters were settled by judgment, that is, according to the letter of law. And there is, again, the kind of system that occurs in Venice, which is a very different kind of law, which is not necessarily, it's a more pragmatic law. It's not a courtroom law. It's very give and take, and you're allowed to take, and I've talked about that in the context and should go back and have a look at that. But what we mean here in we looking at human experiences is that we need to see the relationship between justice and the law and how they're two very different things. Do we come away from the play with a sense of justice? Do we feel that justice has been done, even though law is being upheld? So for example, if Shylock does take his pound of flesh, is that just, or is it law? And there's the difference in those two things, and they're very applicable to ideas in modern society and the way that people see the world and reflect upon it. It seems that prejudice and the status quo are preserved at the end of the play in many ways, and nothing much has changed. We need to think about what effect that has on our understanding of the play and what effect on how we see the world and how perhaps the characters see the world in themselves. That leads us into that sense of the final idea, the tragic drift. And I want to talk about the sense of tragedy in a comedy, because in all of Shakespeare's comedies, there's a point at which things are in a precarious state and could go either way. And there is the potential for things to end in tragedy. And in this comedy, there certainly is a drift towards that tragedy. And Shakespeare talks about that dichotomy, that tragedy and happiness are contrasts, but they're never very far away from each other. They're never very separate. And what we're looking at here is that it's a sort of universal thing in the human experience, that there is a natural resolution of conflict in the comedy, conflict which might have not been resolved. And often we see in real life, if we look at human experiences, those conflicts are not resolved and we have to carry on. And we see in this play that comedy and tragedy have very similar elements, and it's only in outcomes that they may differ a little bit. The Merchant of Venice, as I've said, has a strong drift towards tragedy. And the moment that Shylock's knife is poised above Antonio's chest, tragedy is extremely close. And we're all sitting there thinking when we see the play for the first time, oh, this is really going to happen. This doesn't seem right. And Portia, of course, jumps in and saves him. The potential for tragedy in this play is much closer than in any other of Shakespeare's comedy. So there is a certain complexity to this play that you need to think about in the face of human experiences. And while we intend to celebrate love, we need to see that behind that love in the human experience, there are those darker moments. There are those little bits of tragedy. Now you need to follow up on all those ideas and make sure that you build on them and find examples and get your own quotes and make your own opinions. And I've probably talked a little bit long for this one, but I know that's the one you're interested in. So I'm going to end it there. Good luck with your studies. Hope your human experience are positive ones. Goodbye for now.